Imagine a woman sitting in a solitary confinement cell. She's currently under investigation for theft, and the stress is just completely mounting.
It's a terrifying situation for anyone to be in.
Oh, absolutely terrifying. But then suddenly she looks down at her own hands, and she just completely forgets how to count her fingers.
Which is such a bizarre symptom.
Right, like when they ask her to count them, she points to her 5 fingers and actually says out loud, 1, 2, 3, 5, 7.
Skipping numbers entirely.
Exactly. And when she's asked her name, she gives them the name of her pregnant daughter instead. Plus, she's wearing this rough, scratchy prison nightgown, right? But she strokes it, just totally convinced that it's this luxurious silk dress.
You know, it sounds like pure fiction, like something out of a novel. But this is a meticulously documented medical reality.
Yeah, and that is exactly our mission for today's deep dive. We are exploring a really fascinating, highly detailed psychiatric case study from the year 1902.
It really is an incredible case.
It is, and we're using it to try and answer this profoundly deep question, which is what actually happens to the human mind when reality just becomes, way too agonizing to bear.
Right, when the brain has to protect itself at all costs.
Exactly. So our source material today is this clinical excerpt from the Burkholzli Clinic in Zurich. It documents the case of a prisoner named Godwina F., whose mind just underwent this spectacular, totally bizarre collapse.
And honestly, reading through this 120-year-old medical text, it really doesn't feel like a dry clinical report.
No, not at all. It reads exactly like a psychological thriller.
It really does, because this single case file provides this brilliant window into what early 20th century psychiatrists called the psychopathology of hysteria.
It's a very dramatic term.
Very dramatic, yeah. But it highlights the extreme, almost unbelievable defense mechanisms of the brain. But, to truly understand how a mind creates this impenetrable fortress of amnesia, we can't just look at the breakdown itself.
Right, we have to look at the buildup.
Exactly. We have to look at the pressure cooker that caused it.
Because nobody's mind just snaps for no reason, right? There's always some underlying pressure. So let's unpack Godwina's life for a second, because her foundation was just incredibly fragile right from the start.
Very fragile. She was born on May 15th, 1854.
Yeah, and hardship was basically her baseline. 2 of her sisters died of consumption, and another sister actually died in what the text calls a lunatic asylum.
Which points to a lot of family trauma.
So much trauma. And then Godwina herself starts working in a factory at the age of 14. Fast forward to her adult life, and she becomes wholly dependent on a lover for money.
Right. And the clinic notes specifically say that this lover gave her 20,000 marks about 3 years prior to all this.
Which was an enormous sum of money at the turn of the century, right?
Oh, massive. It was a fortune.
But she blows through it, all of it. So by May of 1902, she is totally stranded in Zurich.
And she's racking up these huge hotel bills.
Yeah. Surviving on these desperate promises to the hotel proprietor that she's waiting for a phantom 10,000 marks from this lover. Money, which, of course, never arrives.
And that precarious, incredibly desperate situation leads directly to the catalyst for her mental break, because she is suspected of theft and officially arrested on May 31st, 1902.
Right. Now, the clinical notes are very clear here. At first, she conducts herself, quite correctly.
She does. Her behavior in custody is quiet. She's actually very respectful to the guards.
But beneath the surface, the pressure is just reaching this critical mass. Think about what's actually sitting on her shoulders right now. Her daughter, who is heavily pregnant, by the way, was also arrested under the same theft charge.
So she's not just worried about herself.
Exactly. So Godwina is sitting there in solitary confinement, completely out of money, facing false charges, and terrified for her unborn grandchild.
It's an emotional load that the human nervous system simply isn't designed to carry indefinitely.
It's just too much. I kept thinking of this like a circuit breaker in a house. You plug in a toaster, a microwave, a hairdryer, and a space heater, all into the exact same outlet.
Everything at once.
Yeah, fear, isolation, guilt, panic. And eventually the emotional wattage just gets way too high, so the system literally shuts down to prevent a fire.
That circuit breaker analogy actually maps perfectly onto how early psychiatrists viewed nervous energy. The snap for Godwina happens on the morning of June 4th, which is her 4th day of detention.
Okay, so what exactly happens that morning?
Well, the wardress opens her cell at 6:30 a.m., and Godwina is just standing there, completely rigid. That quiet, respectable prisoner is totally gone.
Oh, wow. So the switch just flipped overnight.
Literally. She furiously demands that the wardress give back the money she claims was stolen from her. She refuses to eat her food, insisting that it's poison.
And she actually tears the top half of her clothes to shreds, right?
Yes, she completely destroys them.
And then the hallucinations start. Because she claims this black figure with cold hands pushed her into her pillows during the night to steal her gold.
It's a terrifying delusion. And notice how it evolves over just a few hours. By 6:00 p.m. that evening, the district medical officer examines her and finds her completely disoriented.
So she's totally lost touch with reality by evening.
Completely. To use your analogy, the circuit breaker hasn't just tripped. The system has actually rebooted into a completely different, highly distorted operating system.
Right, because she believes she's no longer in a prison at all. She thinks she's in a luxury hotel.
Exactly. She thinks she's eating rich, luxurious food, and that the prison guards are just other hotel guests. She even claims she has millions of marks.
The reality of that cold, solitary prison cell is just so painful that her mind literally grabs a bucket of paint and covers it with a luxury resort. It's wild. So she's understandably transferred to the asylum.
Right, they move her to Berkholtzli.
And when she arrives, she displays what the doctors call a tabula rasa, which is basically a total blank slate of consciousness.
Yes, her power of attention is almost entirely absent. Her intellectual faculties just seem wiped out.
The transcript of the doctors questioning her in this state is absolutely wild. It's a textbook example of something called Ganser syndrome.
Which is characterized by the symptom of the senseless answer.
Yes, the senseless answers. They ask her where she is, and she says, in Munich. They ask her name, she says, don't know. They ask for her Christian name, and she says, Ida.
Which is incredibly significant. Do you remember why?
Because Ida is the name of her pregnant daughter who was arrested with her.
Exactly. The answers she's giving are wrong, but they aren't random. They're deeply connected to her trauma.
But it gets even weirder than that. They show her a watch pointing to 11, and she says it's 1 o'clock. They ask what 3 times 4 is, and she says 2.
Complete disconnect from basic logic.
And then there's the finger counting thing. They hold up 5 fingers and ask how many there are. She says 3. When they tell her to look carefully, she says 7. And then she points to her own 5 fingers and counts them out loud. 1, 2, 3, 5, 7.
And this mental distortion isn't just verbal either. It actually manifests physically.
Oh yeah, the analgesia.
Right. She experiences profound analgesia, which is a total numbness to physical pain. But the strange part is that the numbness shifts illogically around her body.
Wait, what do you mean by shifts around?
Well, at one point, her legs and feet are totally numb to deep pinpricks, while her arms have normal feeling. But then minutes later, the clinical picture changes entirely. Her left arm is suddenly totally numb, and her legs can feel pain again.
That is so strange.
Yeah.
And this one detail from the notes gave me absolute chills. It really highlights how bizarre this state is. So the doctor intentionally pricks her with a pin right under her eyes, right?
Yes, a very sensitive area.
But she doesn't feel the pain. Yet she still actively resists the examination, but in this really strange, detached way. Instead of pulling her face away from the needle, she starts looking for the cause of the pain down in her nightgown or in the bedclothes.
It's as if her brain is consciously denying the reality of what the doctor is doing right in front of her face.
She is fundamentally rejecting the reality of her environment. But, this brings up an incredibly important debate that the clinical observers at the time were actually having.
Right. The question of her actual intent.
Because I have to admit, reading through the source material, I was incredibly skeptical at first. I mean, look at the context here. She owes a massive hotel bill. She's facing real, actual prison time.
The stakes are very high for her.
Exactly. If a doctor asks me what 3 times 4 is, and I want to plead insanity to get out of a jail sentence, just saying 2 is a pretty convenient way to do it. So isn't she just malingering? Just faking it to avoid the consequences?
It's the most natural question to ask, honestly. And you aren't alone in that skepticism. A prominent critic at the time, a psychiatrist named Nissel, argued exactly that.
Okay, so I'm in good company.
You are. Nissel believed this kind of irrelevant talk was either a manifestation of basic catatonia or that the patient was simply faking the whole thing.
But the clinician at Berkholtzli disagrees.
Strongly. The clinician uses a few highly specific incidents to prove that Godwina's state is a genuine subconscious phenomenon.
Right. And the most famous piece of evidence is the silk dress incident, which honestly completely changed my mind about her faking it.
Walk us through what happened there because it's a great example.
Okay, so Godwina is standing by her bed in her rough prison nightgown. And She is highly, highly suggestible in this state. The doctor tells her, "You are wearing a pretty silk dress."
And because she's in this hazy, hypnotic state, she just agrees.
Immediately, she says, "Yes, very pretty," and actually starts stroking the coarse fabric of the nightgown like it's fine silk. But then the doctor tells her she needs to go to bed, and he adds, "You can't go to bed with your clothes on."
So what does she do?
She starts unbuttoning the nightgown.
Huh?
But halfway through, she suddenly freezes. Her whole demeanor shifts, and she says, "But I'm not wearing a nightgown."
And that moment is the crux of the clinician's argument against malingering.
Because it proves she isn't fully in control.
Exactly. Think about the mechanics of a lie. If she were simply a malingerer faking insanity, she would have just played along with the doctor's game and taken the dress off to keep up the charade.
Right.
And if she were fully catatonic, she would have just mindlessly followed the command to undress. But she did neither of those things.
Because taking it off would mean she was standing there naked in front of a doctor.
Precisely. Her subconscious feeling of modesty completely overrode the doctor's hypnotic suggestion. Even in her profoundly altered state, her brain subconsciously knew that if she removed that garment, her dignity would be compromised.
So her mind just abruptly shattered this silk dress illusion specifically to protect her from being exposed.
Yes, that requires a complex subconscious moral reflex that you simply cannot fake.
That is fascinating. And when you look closely at her senseless answers, they aren't just random babble either. The doctors in the text call these semi-intentional negations.
I love that term.
It's so descriptive. Her mind is actively refusing to connect the dots. Like, for example, they ask her if she's ever been to Zurich, and she replies, "Never, but I've stopped with my son-in-law."
But the doctors know her son-in-law actually lived in Zurich.
Right, so she's contradicting herself without realizing it.
Which proves she actually has an unconscious orientation to the truth. The mechanism here is just fascinating. The word Zurich is deeply painful to her because it's where she was arrested, starved, and imprisoned.
So the brain treats it like a banned word.
Basically, yes. But the concept of her son-in-law also stirs up memories of unpleasant family experiences. So her mind pushes the difficult son-in-law to the forefront as a distraction, but flatly actively denies the location of Zurich.
Wow.
It's not a lack of knowledge at all, it's an active, deep restriction of her consciousness. Her brain is working overtime to prevent her from forming an adequate answer that might trigger her trauma.
So her conscious mind is actively hiding these painful truths from her. But that presents a massive roadblock for the doctors, doesn't it? Like, how do you bypass a firewall that the patient doesn't even know she has?
It's a huge challenge. They can't just ask her what happened.
Because she genuinely doesn't have conscious access to the memory, so this is where they had to turn to hypnosis.
Right. And the goal wasn't just to calm her down, which is how we often think of clinical hypnosis today. The goal was to penetrate the total amnesia that was blocking out the days surrounding her arrest.
Okay, so I was trying to wrap my head around this using another tech analogy.
Let's hear it.
So if the initial trauma was a tripped circuit breaker, her current amnesia is like a computer file. The file hasn't actually been deleted off the hard drive, but the operating system has completely hidden the file path.
So the file is there, but it's invisible.
Exactly. The user, Godwina's conscious mind, can't click on it.
Mm-hmm.
So the doctors use hypnosis as a backdoor command prompt to basically bypass the operating system and force access to those restricted files.
That analogy actually maps really well onto how 19th century psychiatrists were beginning to conceptualize the layers of the mind. The data isn't destroyed, user access is just revoked to protect the system from crashing.
But getting that access back couldn't have been easy.
No, it required incredibly specific techniques. First, they used what the text calls the Janet method, named after the pioneering French psychologist Pierre Janet.
Now, I need you to help me out here because reading about the Janet method made my brain tie itself in knots.
It is a bit mind-bending.
Seriously. The notes say they hypnotized her and she still had amnesia. So while she was already hypnotized, they performed the passes to hypnotize her again. Like, how does that even work physically or mentally?
It sounds a bit crazy, I know.
Are they just waving their hands over her a second time? It sounds like something out of the movie Inception.
It does sound like Inception, literally a dream within a dream. To understand how it works, we have to look at Pierre Janet's concept of dissociation. Janet had a famous patient, a medium he called Lucy. And he theorized that human consciousness isn't a single point, it's actually a series of concentric circles. When a person experiences severe trauma, their mind splits or dissociates.
So they basically create a lighter, surface-level personality to deal with the everyday world while burying the traumatized self deeper down.
Precisely. Janet found that if he hypnotized his patient, putting her into a state he called Lucy I, she was calmer, but she still had the amnesia.
Because that first layer of hypnosis only bypassed the outermost conscious defenses.
Exactly. The trauma was buried deeper. So he would treat Lucy I as if she were a fully awake person and run through the hypnotic induction a second time.
Wow.
This forced the mind to drop its next layer of defense, accessing a deeper, older state of consciousness, which he called Lucy III.
So the deeper state possessed the raw memories that were totally inaccessible to the lighter hypnotic state.
Right. The larger circle of memory encompassed the smaller ones.
Hypnotizing a hypnotized person to access a deeper partition of the hard drive. That is incredible, and it worked on Godwina.
It did. They pushed her into this deeper trance state where she suddenly became cataleptic. Her muscles went completely rigid.
And she became profoundly analgesic again, totally numb to all physical pain.
But even in that deep state, the memories didn't just pour out on their own. The doctor still had to pull them to the surface.
So how do they do that?
This is where they combine Janet's theory with the Forel method, named after Auguste Forel.
Right, the situational anchor.
Exactly. You can't just ask an amnesiac in a deep trance, hey, what happened? You have to mentally put the patient back into the exact situational environment of the lost memory.
You have to recreate the scene.
You recreate the sensory details of the trauma to give her mind anchor points around which the hidden memories can crystallize.
The transcript of the scene where they do this is just breathtaking. The doctor is sitting with Godwina in this deep secondary trance. He asks her, how did you get here? She says she doesn't know.
So he sets the scene for her.
Right, he says, you are now in the detention cell. The door is opening. A policeman comes in.
And the sensory cue works instantly.
It's like turning on a light switch. Suddenly, Godwina is right back in that moment. She says, yes, he's taking me to the asylum. The doctor asks how she got there, and she replies, in a cab.
And notice how the emotion comes flooding back with the memory.
Yeah, she isn't just reciting facts.
No, she is reliving the visceral terror of it. She begins describing the cab ride in vivid detail, the thunder and lightning outside the window, the pouring rain.
And she physically shrinks back and says she's awfully afraid of the big fat man who beats her.
The revelation for the clinical team here is massive. The memories were never wiped. Her fundamental orientation to time and place was always perfectly intact.
It was just completely submerged in the subconscious.
And retrieving that data brings a significant amount of healing. Over the next fortnight, with occasional sessions of hypnosis to process these hidden memories, her general condition improves considerably.
She starts reconnecting with reality. It really seems like the doctors have guided her safely out of the woods.
But just as she seems to be healing, a totally random, everyday event happens that proves exactly how fragile this mental suppression really is.
And this relapse is crucial, right? Because it allows the doctors to see the exact mechanical process of hysteria happening in real time.
This takes place a few weeks later, on June 21st. The asylum is hosting a concert for the patients.
Which sounds like a nice, relaxing evening.
You'd think so. Godwina is attending, and she happens to run into a male patient who knew her from before her arrest in Zurich, and this man, completely lacking any tact whatsoever, loudly brings up her brother, Carl F.
Which is literally the absolute worst thing he could have done, because her brother Carl happens to be an habitual criminal.
Exactly. So this guy just blurts out her deepest family shame right there in the middle of a social gathering.
Godwina is obviously visibly upset. I mean, who wouldn't be? She complains about his rudeness afterward, but she eventually goes to bed. However, that night, she suddenly jumps out of bed in sheer, unadulterated terror.
She is totally confused, absolutely disoriented, and has to be physically coaxed back to bed by a fellow patient.
The next day, the doctors examine her, and she presents with what they term systematic negativism.
Meaning she has completely blocked out the event at the concert.
Entirely. She smiles and says she slept very well, her head is clear, and absolutely nothing unpleasant happened. She just built the wall back up overnight.
But here is where the body betrays the mind. When the doctor presses her directly, refusing to let it go, and asks specifically if she had seen the male patient from Zurich, she suddenly blushes deeply.
And tears actually well up in her eyes.
And this is the clinical anomaly. As she is blushing and crying, she relates the affair of the concert in a completely flat, indifferent tone of voice.
Her physical nervous system is screaming that she's in pain, but her conscious voice is just delivering a flat, robotic news report. The disconnect is wild.
That exact disconnect provided a massive theoretical breakthrough for the clinicians. They connected Godwina's immediate physical reaction directly to Joseph Breuer and Sigmund Freud's emerging concept of hysterical conversion.
This is where the 1902 psychiatry really starts to sound modern to me. But let's dig into the actual mechanics of it. What exactly is hysterical conversion?
It's a fascinating theory.
Like, how does an embarrassing conversation at a concert physically turn into an amnesiac night terror?
Well, the underlying mechanism relies on something Breuer and Freud called unabreacted affect.
Okay, unabreacted affect.
In simple terms, abreaction is the physical discharge of an emotion. It's crying when you're sad or shouting when you're angry. It's how the nervous system releases built-up energy.
So an unabreacted affect is an emotional trauma that you're forced to swallow and bottle up.
Exactly. Because she was at a public concert, she couldn't just scream at the man. She had to swallow the shame.
And the theory argues that every person has a specific threshold for how much of this pent-up, unabreacted emotional energy their nervous system can tolerate, right?
Right. We can allow these little traumas to pile up to a point. But when that threshold is crossed, like it was for Godwina with her initial arrest, or triggered again by the shame at the concert, that stored energy has to go somewhere.
The nervous system just can't contain it.
So the emotional energy flows into abnormal channels and literally gets converted into a physical or psychological symptom.
So the overflowing emotion converts into a symptom. But how does the brain choose which symptom to manifest? I mean, why does one person get a paralyzed arm and another forgets their own name?
It follows the line of least resistance. Think of the nervous system like a dam holding back water.
Okay.
When the water level gets too high, it doesn't break the whole dam. It finds the weakest crack and bursts through there.
Wow, I see.
For some patients, their physical biology might be prone to tremors, so the emotional energy converts into physical convulsions. For others, it might be the shifting numbness to pain, the analgesia we saw earlier.
But for Godwina, her psychological line of least resistance was the idea of forgetting.
Yes. The overwhelming urge to just hit the delete key.
Wow.
It wasn't just fear that made her freeze up. It was an unconscious, overpowering drive to aggressively repress anything unpleasant from her awareness.
So Ganser's symptom, giving the senseless answers like 3 times 4 is 2, was just an accessory to this main drive.
Exactly. Her conscious mind was literally drawing back from anything that might trigger a feeling, specifically to protect her sanity.
And here's where this 120-year-old case study gets profoundly relevant for you listening to this today.
Because it's not just ancient history.
Not at all. We don't all develop what the text calls prison psychosis. Most of us aren't experiencing hysterical stupors where we forget how to count our fingers.
Hopefully not.
But we all do a micro version of this every single day, don't we?
Without a doubt, the underlying mechanism is universal.
Think about it. Have you ever conveniently forgotten the name of an ex who broke your heart? Or have you ever completely, inexplicably blocked out a deeply humiliating memory from middle school, only to have a friend bring it up years later and you genuinely have no idea what they're talking about?
It happens to all of us.
Your brain is doing a low-level hysterical conversion. It's actively protecting you from an unabreacted affect. Godwina's case isn't some alien phenomenon. It is just the everyday human urge to forget, but with the volume turned all the way up to 10.
The mental machinery operating in you is exactly the same machinery operating in Godwina. It's only the extremity of the stressor that differs.
So if we look back at the incredible journey of Godwina F's mind, we see a woman pushed to the absolute brink by a life of poverty, the terror of solitary confinement, and the dread of a false charge.
The stress simply overloaded the system and tripped the circuit breaker.
And her mind responded brilliantly, really, in its own distorted way. It generated a hallucinatory luxury hotel to replace a cold cell.
It created a tabula rasa of amnesia where she couldn't count her own fingers, building an impenetrable wall against painful realities.
And it took meticulous medical detective work, using layered hypnosis to bypass her mental firewall, and situational recreation to anchor her, to finally retrieve those buried memories.
It is a stunning testament to the sheer power of the brain's defense systems. When reality becomes too agonizing to bear, the mind doesn't just endure it, it actively rewrites the script entirely to ensure your survival.
And it does so with an astonishing level of internal logic. I mean, even when the output, like calling a rough nightgown a silk dress, looks completely illogical from the outside, the internal mechanism is desperately trying to protect the core self.
Which leaves us with a final, slightly chilling thought for you to take away from this deep dive.
Yeah, because in our modern world, you and I aren't usually facing 19th century solitary confinement. But we are bombarded every single day with overwhelming, anxiety-inducing information.
It's everywhere. The 24-hour news cycle, financial pressure, social media outrage.
The constant pinging of emails and notifications. It's a continuous low-level pressure cooker.
And this raises a very uncomfortable question. If the human mind is capable of spontaneously generating an amnesiac fortress, literally editing reality on the fly to protect itself from extreme stress, how much of our everyday reality is being subtly edited right now?
Exactly. How much of your memory or your attention span or your perception of the world is currently being repressed, smoothed over, or just completely ignored by your brain just to help you get through a Tuesday?
It's a lot to think about.
We really like to think our internal video camera is recording everything perfectly. But maybe, just maybe, our circuit breakers are tripping in tiny, invisible ways all the time, muddying the waters of our own minds and keeping us blissfully unaware of the cracks in the glass. Keep questioning your reality, just a little bit.